Okay, so today we are going to be starting a new series through the book of Daniel. If you've been here the last couple of weeks, we have done things a little bit differently to start off the year. 2 weeks ago, we discussed what it means to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus, and we looked at what that means for us here at Poly. So what does it in general mean to be a disciple, but what does it mean to be a disciple here at Poly? And last week, we discussed the vision and values of University Church, why we exist as a church here at Poly, and what we're trying to accomplish here at Poly. But this week, we're going to start a new series going through the book of Daniel. Normally, that's what we do. We take a book of the Bible and go through it. If you're new to the Bible, you might think of the Bible as one book, and it is one book. But it's also a collection of a bunch of different, separate, smaller books and letters. So one of those happens to be Daniel. The book of Daniel covers a particular time period in the history of God's people. The nation of Israel was united at one time as a single nation under King David and then King Solomon. But after King Solomon, the nation divided into two separate nations. A big reason for this split was complaints about taxes. So one thing we can learn right there is that some things never change. People don't like taxes. So the nation of Israel split in 937 BC after the death of King Solomon over the issue of taxes. When it split, it became two separate nations, the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which took the name Judah. Those two separate nations became weaker as individual nations, and they both ended up being conquered. The northern kingdom, Israel, was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC, so about 200 years after they divided. The southern kingdom, Judah, was then later conquered by the Babylonians in 605 BC, and then just for good measure, they came back again in 597 BC and conquered them again. And then for good measure, they came back in 586 BC and conquered them again. Especially more brutal toward the end there in 586 BC. Now, one tactic of the Babylonians when they would conquer a society is they would take the healthiest, brightest, strong, healthy, young people, and they would take them as prisoners back to Babylon, the capital city of the Babylonian Empire. And there in Babylon, they would train them into Babylonian culture and the ways of the Babylonian royal court, and put them into service in the government as government workers. Doing this accomplished two things. First, it deprived the conquered nation of their future leaders. The young, smart, healthy people would be taken away. So the conquered nation couldn't easily rise up in rebellion anytime soon. And second, it ensured that the Babylonian government had this steady stream of good potential future workers. So that's why they would do that. Now, we actually know a lot about this and these events, not just from the Bible, although they are recorded in the Bible, but through other historical and archaeological records from the Assyrians and the Babylonians, because they kept their own records. For example, the destruction of Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, by the Babylonians, is recorded in a stone tablet called the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle. And we're going to read in Daniel chapter 1 in just a minute. King Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned right off the bat in the very beginning. And as we read Daniel chapter 1, the last sentence of this first chapter mentions a Persian king named Cyrus. And a lot of what we have in the Bible about King Cyrus is also recorded in a Persian document called the Cyrus Cylinder. And I should just put a couple pictures. Thanks to the British Museum, we have these pictures. So on the left there is the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle, and on the right is the Cyrus Cylinder, which also record these events from the perspectives of the Babylonians and the Persians. So we have a lot of information about this and how these groups acted. So as we read through the book of Daniel this year, we're going to be looking again at this particular time period in the history of God's people. And this is basically the 500s BC. The people of God have been defeated by the Babylonians, taken as prisoners back into the Babylonian capital. And this time period is known as the Babylonian captivity. And that's where Daniel, the person, is. That's where this book is going to begin, in the Babylonian captivity. It begins with the nation of Israel being conquered. It begins with imprisonment, enslavement. It begins with these people being taken from their homes. It begins with the apparent loss of everything. They've lost their nation, they've lost their homeland, they've lost their freedom. But one of the great things that we'll see in this book as we go through is that even when things appear to be going horribly wrong, God is always in control. He is always there, and he is in absolute control. God is still working in these events to fulfill all of his promises to us. In fact, when things seem to be going bad, we can be confident knowing that God is there with us, in control, and he's ultimately making everything work for our good so that we have nothing to worry about. We can always trust God. Have you ever wondered how you can live faithfully for God in a world that's falling apart? Well, that's something we're also going to see in this book of Daniel. How can Daniel and his friends, these Jewish young men who have been taken captive, living in a foreign land, how can they serve God? How can we serve God in a culture that seems largely opposed to biblical values? And when we think about that, we can think about the world today. We can think about America as a whole and its opposition to biblical values. We could think about college culture individually. I don't know if you guys have noticed this yet. I mean, some of you have been here a few years, some of you have been here a few weeks, but college culture and biblical values don't always line up. Okay? So how can you be faithful in that environment? And that's what we're going to see as we go through the book of Daniel. There's a sense in which we're living in Babylon right now. You know, as Christians, we have a different homeland, the Bible tells us. We're citizens of heaven, but we're living in an environment that is not our ultimate home. We're living in an environment that is not always going to line up with our values. So Daniel actually has a lot to say to us. And of course, you know, as I say that, you know, biblical values compared to cultural values, that doesn't mean that everything around us is evil. It doesn't mean that we're at war with our culture. We shouldn't be. But it does mean that we recognize in some ways where we are right now is not our true and ultimate home. But the book of Daniel can give us hope in that environment. So let's read Daniel chapter 1. So you can follow along here as I read. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to attend to the king. Among them, from the Judahites, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave them the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank, so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch, yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend to the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Okay, so quickly, let's look at some context. Verse 1 there tells us right off the bat that the story begins with the Babylonian king conquering Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. And that's 605 BC. So that's where the story begins, in 605 BC. And Daniel is taken captive in that first wave of people. And then at the end of the chapter, verse 21, it tells us Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That is 539 BC. 539 BC. So right here, we see that Daniel is spending most of his life, this long period of time, from 605 to 539, most of his life he's going to be spending in this foreign land. So Daniel, as a Jew, must figure out how can he continue to be faithful to God as a prisoner in this foreign land? How can he be faithful as a Jew living outside of Israel? How can he do that? That's what he's got to figure out. What does it mean to be Jewish without the temple that has been destroyed, without the priest system, the sacrifices? What does it mean to be faithful in those circumstances? Now, we're looking at Daniel, but it's important that we see a little bit from another prophet, another biblical book telling us about this time, the book of Daniel, or Jeremiah, giving us a little bit more context. This is what Jeremiah 29:1 tells us. This is the text of a letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining exiled elders, the priests, the prophets, and all the people Nebuchadnezzar had deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, find wives for yourselves and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters to men in marriage, so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive. So this is telling us that the people of God who have been taken into captivity in this foreign land were supposed to continue living their lives. They're supposed to continue getting married, having children, continue doing the things that people do. And while they're there, they're supposed to be praying for and serving and helping prosper the land that they're in. Now remember, this is a place that had defeated them and taken them prisoner. But they're supposed to seek its well-being. One of the things we'll see in this book is that God had actually planned the captivity from the beginning. And his plan was to use this captivity to fulfill his ultimate promises to bless the whole earth, all the nations of the earth. And God has a plan for your time equally, right here at Poly. You're not here by accident. Daniel wasn't there by accident. He's working through all these events to bring the good news of Jesus to the entire world. He wants you to be a blessing to this community. God wants you to make friends here. He wants you to do the things college students do within biblical values. Join clubs, make friends, study hard, do well in school. He wants you to do those things. He wants you to be a blessing to the community that you're in. He wants us as a church, University Church, to be a blessing on this campus. Look back at verse 7 there. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive. The people who were taken into captivity were told to do that, and we are told to do that in our lives right here as well. Do that at Poly. As we go through the book of Daniel, we'll see God working to establish his eternal kingdom. And we'll see him use regular people, his people, to accomplish that goal. But let's be absolutely clear that he is the one who makes this happen. It's not us establishing his kingdom. He's doing it. He works through us because that's how he's chosen to work. But he is the one who's in absolute control. And we will see that throughout Daniel chapter 1. First, we see that God gave them over to captivity. That's the first point there. God gave them over to captivity. If we look at verse 2, it says, the Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, Nebuchadnezzar, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. God handed him over. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's victory was because of God. The reason Nebuchadnezzar won against Jehoiakim wasn't ultimately because Nebuchadnezzar had more experience conquering lands. It wasn't ultimately because they had a better army or anything like that. It wasn't because he's a better leader. It was because God gave Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. God did that. God was in control. This is a common theme running throughout the entire Old Testament. God can give victory to whoever he wants to give victory to. He gave victory to Israel as they were entering the promised land, invading the territories. He gave victory to Samson over all the people he fought. He gave victory to Gideon and his very small army against a much larger army. God can give victory to whoever he wants. And of course, if God is in control of the victory, then he's in control of the results. Let's be there. God was in control of them being taken to Babylon. When the rest of the verses 3-7 tell us about the captives being taken off to Babylon, that was all part of God's plan too. Way back in Leviticus, which would have been written several hundred years before this, God warned his people that if they didn't keep his covenant, they would be taken into exile, that God would send an invading army to defeat them and take them as prisoners to serve in a foreign land. That was prophesied hundreds of years before this. A few decades before this event, another prophet, Habakkuk, prophesied that Babylon was going to be coming and would defeat them and take them into captivity. Again, this was all part of God's plan. God had said this would happen. He was in absolute control. So this was his plan. And then C, Babylonian culture tried to assimilate them. We see that as well. Even though God was in control, and it was God's plan for them to be taken to Babylon, the Babylonian culture is then going to try to assimilate them. The four people named in this passage, the four Hebrew people, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they all had names that in Hebrew referenced God. Okay, Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means the Lord is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. And Azariah means the Lord is our helper. But the four of them, when they get to Babylon, are given new names, Babylonian names, that in their language reference their gods. That was just an attempt to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. This is an intentional effort. You might know that this has happened in lots of cultures, including American cultural history. Sometimes it's voluntary. Many times when immigrants would come to America, entering some place like Ellis Island or whatever port they were entering through, they might change their names. They might anglicize their names to sound more American. Sometimes they did that. Sometimes schools would do that against people's wishes. They would just change foreign-sounding names and make them more American in order to assimilate people into our culture. This was a desire to make this group of people coming in seem like they belonged here. And that's what's happening to these Hebrew men. But the men had to decide what was acceptable for them and what was not. What could they do in good faith and still be faithful to God? And what could they not do? What could they do and glorify God in their lives? And what could they not do? And they decided they could deal with the new names. I mentioned last week that I have 3 kids who are all named after missionaries. That's a great thing. I want to honor those missionaries and what they did. And I hope my kids grow up to love God the way those missionaries did. But names aren't magical in that sense. Okay, as Christians, when somebody has a non-Christian name and they become a Christian, we don't make them change their names. You might know that in Islam, it's actually very normal. If somebody converts to Islam, they change their names to an Islamic name. But in Christianity, we don't do that. Names are just names. We usually are careful in how we pick names. We might honor someone, but they're names. And these men decide that they can deal with that. But then, verse 8 tells us something. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. So this is the breaking point where he says, no, this is what I will not do. Now you might be wondering, why is this food situation the breaking point? Why is this too much? Why couldn't he eat the food? Well, here's the answer. We don't know. Some people have tried various explanations for why this could be. Some people have said, well, maybe the food, wasn't killed, the meat wasn't killed according to Jewish rules, kosher. Maybe there was certain types of meat like pork that Jews can't eat. Those are all, possibilities, but that doesn't really explain why he couldn't drink the wine. Another possibility proposed is that the meat and the wine might have been offered or sacrificed to one of the foreign gods, and they didn't want to participate in that. And that's also a possibility, but that was very common in ancient cultures, but it would have also been common to sacrifice and dedicate the vegetables to the foreign gods as well, so that we're not sure of. Another possibility is that because this was the king's food and the allotment of the king's food, it was sort of like dining with the king, which, when we eat together, we're building relationships. And maybe they just didn't want to have that association of like eating with the king. And that's a possibility as well. But the truth is, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us why Daniel wouldn't eat the food. And the reason the Bible doesn't tell us is because it doesn't matter to the story. The story that they're telling us here is not affected by this. Any one of those possibilities I mentioned could be true, and it wouldn't change the point of this story one bit. Because the point of this story is that God is in control. That's the point we're going to see as we move through here. So why Daniel wouldn't eat the food, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. When you read the Bible, you need to be looking, what is the point of this passage? And that's what I said about our inductive Bible studies. We look at the details, and then from the details, we figure out what is the point here. And that's critical reading. That's how you read anything, hopefully. And that's what we do here. So as we read, we need to be looking for what's the point. Sometimes people get off on these tangents, and they start trying to find, they get curious about something like that. What is the point, or why wouldn't Daniel eat this? And you'll hear people come up with all sorts of hypotheses and go on long tangents about it, but that's not the point. If we needed to know that, the Bible would have told us that. But it doesn't tell us, because that's not the point. So, what is the point? Let's look at the next verse. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Just as God gave victory to Nebuchadnezzar, God gave Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch, the servant of the king in charge of him, his supervisor. So that's the second thing we need to see here. God gave Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. And we see here an example of that simple fact that God is in control of hearts and minds. There. God was in control of Pharaoh's heart in Egypt. The story of the Exodus tells us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In the story of Nehemiah, if you're familiar with that story, Nehemiah was a servant of a king, and it tells us that the king had his heart softened toward Nehemiah so that the king would go along with Nehemiah's plan to restore the temple. And so God did that. Proverbs tells us directly that the king's heart is in control of God, and God directs the king's heart wherever he wants. And we see that here in Daniel 1:9, that it's not just king's hearts, it's everyone's hearts, even the chief eunuch. He controls our hearts. Now, why does he do this? That's B. God directs hearts and minds for his eternal purposes. I mentioned that the Bible is both one book, but also a collection of books. Now, obviously, it's one book, because if you have a printed Bible, like Ralph does over there, it's bound together as one book. But it's also one book in the sense that it tells one overarching story. Even though it's a collection of shorter books and letters written over thousands of years by dozens of people, it's one overarching story. It tells how God is working through history to fulfill his promises. It tells the story of how each one of us has sinned against God. We've rebelled against God, refused to follow God's directions, done things our own ways, sought our own glory over God's glory. But then God worked in history and in our lives to rescue us for himself and to build a nation of people dedicated to him. That one day we're all going to be together as believers in heaven. That's the story of the Bible. He's accomplishing that plan. He led the Roman emperor to have a census so that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. And if you're a Christian, he changed your heart too. Ezekiel describes it as having a heart of stone turned into a heart of flesh by God. He described it as being dead in a valley of dry bones and being brought back to life by God. The Bible tells us that faith is a gift from God. So if you're a Christian today, it is ultimately because God worked in your heart. God changed your heart. He made you see the truth, the reality of your own sin. And he gave you the ability to turn to God and trust in him instead. The same power that worked in Daniel's life worked in all of our lives as Christians. And that leads to C, pray for God to change hearts and minds. If you're a Christian, then you certainly want more people to know about Jesus. You want more people to turn away from their sin and trust in Jesus. And you need to be praying that God would change hearts. We can tell people about Jesus, and we should tell people about Jesus. We're told to tell people about Jesus. But ultimately, it's God who changes hearts, not us. You cannot convince someone to put their trust in Jesus if God doesn't change their hearts. In one sense, this is incredibly good news, because it's not up to you to be social enough or persuasive enough, convincing enough. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes Christians worry about that. What if I try and I mess up? What if they ask a question I can't answer? You don't ultimately have to worry about that because it's not ultimately up to you. You don't need to be cool enough or have enough social influence to convince someone to become a Christian. Daniel certainly did not have any social influence, but God gave him what he needed. All God asks from you is that you are faithful to what he has called you to, the task. Tell people about Jesus and pray that God changes their hearts. Pray that he sends out more laborers into the harvest. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Pray that God sends out people to tell people about Jesus. Pray that he sends you, that he gives you the heart and the desire to go out and be faithful and to tell people about Jesus. And pray that all of us here at University Church and believers around the world have the joy of seeing more people come to know Jesus. Now, a third thing we see in this passage is that God gave them wisdom and knowledge. If we look at verse 17, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. So God can make you successful to accomplish his plans. In the story of Daniel, God is giving success to these 4 Hebrew young men because God is going to use them in bringing salvation to the nations, to the world. If you're familiar with the story of Joseph in the Bible, it's a similar situation. Joseph was sold into slavery, into a terrible situation, and yet God blessed him and made him successful. Successful in not only saving Egypt, but saving the family of Israel to accomplish God's purposes. God used Joseph to save his people as part of the overarching plan of the Bible through history. And here in Daniel, God is using Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to bless the Babylonians and to bless the whole world as God fulfills his promises to make a nation that is a blessing to the world. It's all part of God's story throughout history. And be there. God is the one who gives knowledge as well. That's an important part of the story here, but it's also important for you and your lives right now. When it says that God gave them knowledge and understanding in every type of literature and wisdom, it certainly doesn't mean that he just instantly put it in their minds that they could talk about Socrates and give you the cliff notes on all the great literature that you read in English class. They had to work. The writer, though, is telling us here that as these men studied, as they were in school in Babylon, God is the one who gave them the ability to be successful and to do even better than all the people around them. Now, why did God do that? Because God wanted them to have those positions close to the king. God wanted them to have opportunities that they would get by being advisors to the king. And so God made that happen. God always makes his plans happen. He is in control. And that's true for you too. If you're here at Poly, as you guys are, you're undoubtedly smart people. Okay? You're probably somebody who worked hard in school in the years, high school and things like that, in order to get into a good college. You earned admission to this university. But ultimately, all the abilities you had to work hard, the intelligence you have, ultimately all came from God. He gave it to you. We can look at Deuteronomy 18. So Deuteronomy is written to the people hundreds of years before as they're getting ready to enter the promised land. They're getting ready to enter this land flowing with milk and honey, this blessing that God has promised them. But then God tells them, when you eat and are full and build beautiful houses to live in, and your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold multiply, and everything else you have increases, be careful that your heart doesn't become proud, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of every place of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness, with its poisonous snakes and scorpions, a thirsty land where there was no water. He brought water out of the flint rock for you. He fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your ancestors had not known, in order to humble and test you, so that in the end he might cause you to prosper. You may say to yourself, my power and my own ability have gained this wealth for me. But remember that the Lord your God gives you the power to gain wealth in order to confirm his covenant he swore to your ancestors, as it is today. So again, these people are entering the promised land, and God is telling them that he's going to bless them. They are going to be successful. But he didn't just make the crops grow. Like, they didn't just have to sit down and watch crops magically grow. They didn't just say, I hope a house appears over there. And a house appeared. Like, they did things. They planted crops. They harvested crops. They built houses. They worked. And that's where the temptation comes in, to think, I did this. I made this happen. But God's saying, no. Your ability to do those things comes from me. Yes, work hard. Yes, study hard. Yes, be successful. But remember, you didn't create your brain. God gave you that brain. And that's why we're commanded to do everything we do for the glory of God, because everything we have ultimately comes from God. So keep that in mind as you go through school here at Poly. It's easy to think, again, that you're just here because you're smart, that you worked hard, or whatever. And those might be true things. You're smart. You worked hard. You applied. But the ability to do those things ultimately comes from God. Everything you have that was necessary to get here came from God. God put you here. And that's true for the good things in your life, and it's good for the bad things in your life as well. God didn't find these 4 young Hebrew men in Babylon and say, I better help them. Their being in Babylon was part of God's plan. Something that seemed bad was part of God's plan. There had been prophets telling about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. As I said, even back in Leviticus, it was promised that if they disobeyed, that would happen. But we're going to see throughout the book of Daniel, and I hope you will see throughout the Bible, is that God is always in control. And he's always working through events to fulfill his promises for us. And this should be an encouragement to us. When things appear to be going well, even when you've worked hard for them, praise God, because he's given you that. And when things seem to be going poorly, praise God, because he's in control and you can trust him. He's working all things for our good. Romans 8 tells us that. No matter what is happening, God is working them for our good. You might have even had experiences in your lives where things happen that you certainly wouldn't have chosen to happen. But in the end, you can see how they helped you in some way. God is always working for our good. Even persecution, it tells us in Romans 8. This also means that you can trust your academic future to God. If he wants you to be an engineer, he's going to give you all the things that you need to be an engineer. There's still work involved. You're still going to have to study. Daniel and his friends still studied. The Israelites still built houses. You're still going to have to take hard classes. Still have to take Calc 2 probably. If you're a mechanical engineering, you still have to take strengths of materials or fluid mechanics. If you're in computer science, you still have to take architecture. If you're an EE major, you still have to take circuits too. Those are still going to be hard. But God is going to give you what you need to fulfill His purposes in your life. In your job later on, God's going to be there too. He's going to be in control. If you get fired from a job, you can trust that God is in control. Even when bad things happen, He's still in control. If school doesn't go how you hoped and you lose a scholarship, you can trust that God is in control. You have not messed up God's plans for you. God is there, and He is in control. So, in conclusion, throughout this chapter, we see that God is in control. God gave them over to captivity. God gave Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. God gave them wisdom and knowledge. That is the point of this chapter. That's why it doesn't tell us what the reason Daniel had for not eating the food, because it doesn't matter. The point here is that God is in control. Even when things seem bad, God is in control. Even when you're outside of the promised land, as a prisoner, God is in control. Even when you're facing challenges in your life, God is in control. When your culture is pushing you to compromise in some way and you wonder what will happen if you refuse to compromise, God is in control. Now, that doesn't mean things are always going to go well. You may be taken prisoner. Some biblical heroes were killed. But even in those situations, God was in control. Joseph, near the end of his life, after having been sold into slavery and all the things that came with that, said that this was meant for evil by his family who sold him into slavery, but God meant it for good. God was in control. The first Christian martyr was a man named Stephen, a deacon, who preached one sermon and they killed him after it. But it tells us that because of the persecution that came with that, other Christians fled. Sounds bad. Preach one sermon, you get killed, and other Christians are persecuted and have to flee. But as they fled, it tells us they spread the good news of Jesus into all the cities they went to. It was part of God's plan to fulfill His promise to take the good news outside of Jerusalem. The Bible tells us over and over that God is in control. And when you look at the world today, you might see chaos. You see things that it doesn't seem like God is in control. But you can know that God is in control. And it's not just on the big events, the world stage. God is paying attention to every little event. God is paying attention to you and your life. God is always in control of every single detail. And in the end, it will work out exactly as He has promised. If you're a Christian, it's all going to lead to you and every other believer being together, united in heaven forever. That's the only possible end for us as believers. It's promised and it's guaranteed by Jesus. Whether you die as a martyr like Stephen, the first time you share the good news, hopefully that won't happen. But if that happens, or if you're fired from your job because you refuse to compromise in some way, the outcome of all of it is that God wins and He brings us with Him to heaven. But if you're not a Christian, what if you're not a Christian, you're here? What if you don't trust God in this way? What if you've never thought about God in this way? If you're not a Christian, then you should know that the God of the universe cares about you too. And He is in control. He sees you. He's paying attention. He has blessed you in countless ways. Your brain came from Him as well. And He wants a relationship with you. He's giving you the opportunity here today to respond to that and to trust in Him. So I invite you, if you're in that situation, talk to one of us later. Ask us about it at lunch. Ask questions. Come to the small group Bible studies we're starting so you can read more of the Bible. Consider the claims of the Bible. And ultimately, we are calling on you to do the same thing that we do, which is to trust in Jesus. So now, pray with me. Father, we come to you today believing that you are the sovereign King of the universe. You created everything from nothing, and now nothing is beyond you. There's nothing that surprises you because you are all-knowing. There's nothing that escapes your authority because you are all-powerful. But we also come to you, not just because you're the God who's in control, but because you're the God who loves us, who adopted us into your family, who calls us your sons and daughters. We come to you in faith, knowing that we are yours, that you have redeemed us. If you were all-powerful but not loving, that would not be good news for us. If you were loving but not in control, that would not be good news for us. But you combine completely both power and love. And so we can come to you and worship you in confidence and peace, knowing that you care for us, both in your desire to bless us and in your actions that guarantee our blessing. And we know that you've called us to be a blessing to the world around us. We confess to you that too often we do not think of how we can bless the people around us. We confess that too often we do not consider the needs of those around us. We confess that too often we do not bother to tell others about you and how you can satisfy their greatest needs. We know that we have become your children because you changed our hearts and gave us faith. Now we ask that by your Spirit you change our hearts to give us the desire to be your ambassadors here at Florida Poly. Give us the desire to find ways to serve others. Give us the desire to see others come to know you. And give us opportunities to do that. Give us whatever it is we need to accomplish your will. Give us the opportunity to build your kingdom on this campus. Help us to be dependent on you in this process. We confess that sometimes we get worried and fear taking risks for your name. We don't want to talk to others about you because we worry about messing it up or because we worry about our own reputations. We confess in those times we're making idols out of ourselves, believing that it's up to us to change hearts, believing that our reputations are important. Help us to set aside our own fears and our own reputations for your glory. Help us truly understand and truly believe that the results of our work are up to you, and all you've called us to is faithfulness. Help us truly understand and truly believe that our own reputations have no value compared to your glory and compared to the joy of seeing people come to know you. Help us every day as we go about our studies or our jobs to trust that you've given us whatever it is we need to succeed in your plans. Help us every day to be thankful to you for what you have given us. Let us never take it for granted that everything we have comes from you. But by your Spirit, help us to know how we can glorify you in everything we do. Help us as a church encourage one another in this process. Help us to keep pointing each other in the right direction, to keep each other on track. Help us remind each other of the promises we have in you. And we ask all of this in the name of Jesus, because every promise we have from you has been earned for us by him. Amen.